So today we're going to be talking about a very difficult topic, and I think as well a very difficult word for people to even say aloud. You know, the word suicide is often something that people don't want to discuss, and we wanted to bring this conversation together today to really bring light to suicide, but also come at it from, I'm guessing today, a very personal point of view as well. Now, Suicide Prevention Day, World Suicide Prevention Day is happening on the 10th of September, happens every single year. And I never would have imagined that in my line of work that has become the busiest day for me. And the reason why it's become the busiest day for me is because of my own personal experience, which, you know, I'll be touching on today. And I'm sure alongside Emily and Sylvia, we'll all be talking about our own experiences of suicide too. But before we do that, I think, you know, I was looking at some of the statistics before this call, and there's statistics that I shout about all of the time. You know, suicide is the biggest killer of men under 45 in the UK. Suicide is the current biggest killer of young people in the UK. In the world, someone takes their own life every 40 seconds. You know, yet the shocking thing I think about these statistics are these are purely recorded suicides, you know, suicide on a death certificate. And this is a conversation that I think we've shied away from for too long when we're looking at the impact that suicide has on a lot of people across the world. And you know, I'm grateful that I'm joined by two amazing people here today to discuss on this topic. So in terms of suicide, very, very difficult subject. And I think we're all kind of conditioned to see suicide in a particular way. There's a lot of misconceptions. And I want to start there, if you both don't mind. And I'm sure we'll talk about our own personal experiences as we go on. But opening up the floor to both of you, the misconceptions around suicide, you know, look at the word commit. You look at, you know, oh, it's attention seeking, it's selfish. You know, we've heard a lot of this throughout our lives as a whole. But I wanted to put it out to you, you know, what are the biggest misconceptions that you see in particular around suicide as well?
I've got a couple of ideas around that. Firstly, the word commit. Commit implies a lot of the time a shame. It's a shameful act. It's a wrongdoing. And also trying to move away from that word of commit because there has connotations of it being a criminal act. Suicide was decriminalised in the UK early 1960s, so it's not a criminal act. Yes, for a lot of people it is a criminal act in a different way, from a religious, from a belief and values point of view. But using that word commit, I would, you know, I'm always advocating to use, as a lot of them, end one's own life, or complete is the latest word that we should be using. To your point about every 40 seconds, the Mental Health Foundation, World Health Organization, says that every completion, there are 20 attempts, and they're the ones that are recorded. But I think there is a lot of, as you say, attention seeking. Why, when that person's got X, Y, and Z, why? And then the human being's somewhat insatiable need to understand. So a lot of people cannot understand why someone would take their own life. So they start to put their own spin and their own perceptions on it. Someone that I know just recently taken their own life. Oh, why do they do this? Why do they do that? Was it because of this? Was it because of that? We will never know. And I think that's because it really jars with people's beliefs and values. How is that possible? But I think if we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes to understand, yes, it is possible, and that's what happens. And even if we don't understand, let's at least accept.
It's a really important point about the language that we use around people attempting to or taking their own lives. I think the other key thing for me is around the conception that people who do attempt to take their own lives are doing it for attention, or they're doing it for some other reason than, you know, an attempt to end their own life. There is a lot of very damaging discourse around, well, they didn't mean to do it, or they didn't want to do it, they weren't going to go through with it, or if you were serious, you'd have done it. And I think that's something we've got to challenge, because, you know, there's almost an element of daring somebody to go through with the most dreadful thing. And from a mental health perspective, that's an incredibly awful thing to happen. To not believe people who report suicidal ideation or attempted suicides. There's a lot of people who say, no, they didn't really do it, or they didn't really mean that, or you're just saying it to get attention, or to get back at me personally, if it's the person who's being reported to. And I think we have to challenge that, because for every one of those people who have taken their own lives, they were literally a heartbeat away from not doing so. And people need to think about their role in being that cause, potentially, and pushing people over the edge.
Notes as well. Sometimes we see this, don't we, on documentaries or programs on the TV, or they left a note. It means that they were serious about it or not. In my particular instance, I didn't leave any notes when I tried to take my own life, because I had no one to leave a note to. So again, I think that's another misconception as to whether someone's intention or not, whether they left a note or not.
I think there's some really valid points there, and I think a lot of it, as you're both talking, and I've got my own opinions of it as well, it comes back to the lack of education, and then because of that lack of education, the shame that it adds on to people that have either been bereaved by suicide or have been in a suicidal situation themselves. And Sylvia, you've already kind of alluded to it then, but I think personal experience is so key in this space, and for us to be vulnerable today, I think it can encourage other people to be vulnerable too. And, I want to touch on our own personal experiences of suicide, because for me, key reason why I do this work, key reason why I'm in this space is because of my dad. My dad sadly took his own life when he was 45 years old. I was 18 years old when it happened. And I think, those moments I think back, my dad had no real signs of mental illness leading up to his breakdown in his first attempt. My dad, for us to even know there was an issue with his mental health, maybe that was our naivety, our arrogance towards mental illness leading up to that. But we didn't know there was an issue until he was in a very difficult situation. And 6 days after that difficult situation, my dad made a very serious attempt on his life. And it's like we didn't realize it until he was in that crisis place. And losing my dad to suicide, was such a hard grief. And, I think, Sylvia, you mentioned it, the unanswered question of why, and what tore me apart was trying to answer that why. Trying to answer that why, because I was taught that there's a simplistic reason why my dad would have took his own life. I used to get asked it all the time. What, did he lose money? Was him and your mum struggling? What was going on? What was that one thing that caused my dad to end his own life? And when I tried to find that one thing, it led me down a very dark hole myself. And now realizing how complex suicide is, that one reason is always very difficult to find. I don't think there ever is one reason why someone would take their own life. But, and after my dad, I remember the shame and judgment and not wanting to talk about it, because again, I thought I was the minority of someone that had maybe lost someone to suicide so close to me. And then before I know it, a friend from school sadly took his own life. I heard of more and more and more and more and more. And prior to that, the only time I heard of suicide was on the media, or if people were complaining because the train's been delayed because someone's taken their own life, right? And I never thought about it. But yeah, I want to touch on sort of your personal experiences, if you don't mind sharing as well, because I know we've all got experiences of this. Sylvia, do you want to start? I know you touched on it.
I first had I don't want to be here thoughts when I was 16. And I actually don't know why. I just did. I don't want to be here. I remember my tutors telling my parents, Sylvia is somewhat of an enigma at school, but no one ever explored that or asked me what was going on. So, and I was brought up in an environment where you just get on with it. And then the next time I started having thoughts was when I was married, and some very serious thoughts then. And I actually went to the doctor at that time to be told, now this is odd these days, to be told, well, if you had a child, Sylvia, that may make things so much better for you. That's exactly what I was told by my GP. And they gave me some medication, and I thought, well, that's not going to work. And then, of course, when I had my I call it my personal perfect storm a few years later, when my marriage broke up because it was, now you'd be coercive controlling. And then there was some underlying stuff from my childhood that then popped up as well, because I'm from a very dysfunctional family. There's a lot of horrific stuff went on in my childhood. So that all sort of culminated and came up. And then I was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, with cancer. So that chucked that in the mix as well. But I bravely soldiered on because I was brought up in an environment where you just get on with it. And at that time, you don't talk about it, because I didn't know how to articulate or express how I felt. I thought everyone felt isolated, alone and miserable and sad from time to time. I just thought that's what everyone does. And because no one spoke about it, you don't get an idea of the depth of that feeling. I had my job, which I was very good at, and that was my escape. That was my place where I could go to and just be, and be the one thing that I believed I was good at. But no one saw, when I got home and closed the door, how desperate things were. Now, I managed in that state for about 2 or 3 years, but ambivalent to life, really. I couldn't really care less whether I lived or died. But there's a line from a Robbie Williams song, I think I've quoted it to you before: I don't want to die, but I'm not keen on living either. But I gradually started to get worse. No one at work ever said anything. The mask went on tighter and tighter and tighter. But then I started to have I don't want to be here thoughts. And at that point, in hindsight, I should have done something about it, but I didn't. Because for me, going to speak to someone it was driven by a sense of failure. My sense of failure, that if my parents don't love me, if everything's fallen apart, I am unlovable, I'm not worthy. So it's driven by failure. So after my third failed attempt, I think you've heard this bit before, after my third failed attempt, I went to my GP because I was so angry that in my world, I'd failed again, another failure. And I remember saying, I'm such a failure, I cannot even do myself in. Please, will you help me to live? Because my thought processes were, if I failed at taking my own life, then I'll have to try and do something else. I have to try and succeed at living. She asked me loads of questions, which I got quite cross about, which in hindsight was all to do with the diagnosis that I had a general depressive disorder, and probably been struggling with that since about 9 when I was a child, but I had no idea. So she recommended counselling and medication, and I thought, I'll give it a go. I'll give anything a try. But, trite and cheesy, when I was in counselling, I transformed and became a completely different person, and then went on to train to be an integrative counsellor myself, and a coach and a master coach, and all the things that I do now. So in a way, my curse, this failure, became my blessing, which is ironic in a way, but that's what happened. Having said all that, I never once told anyone at work that I was struggling with my mental health or my diagnosis. It was easy to tell them I was having time off for my treatment for cancer, because again, I still didn't want people to know that, not through any fear or shame, but I didn't want people to put their spin on it, to distort or generalize or misinterpret or hear what they want to hear and disregard the rest, put their perceptions on why. And also, it's a very private thing. I didn't want everyone to know my stuff. So, but I did recover, and I am survived, and I now thrive and I flourish. And I get emotional sometimes as to what it is about me that enabled me to do that, when other people, like your father, Paul, didn't. And if I could bottle that and sell it, wow, that'd be brilliant.
Thank you so much for sharing, Sylvia. Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it? Like you say, I mean, how some people have that moment or that thing that helps them, and then other people don't. And similar to you, I was fortunate. I was in a very dark place, and I had that help. Whereas my dad didn't. And I carry that same burden as well, Sylvia, of like, why did I manage to find that help and my dad didn't, right? But equally, like you say, I think turning these negative experiences into positives, or using them as much as we possibly can to try and help others, I think is really encouraging. So thank you so much for sharing.
I would just add one thing, because a lot of people talk about having support teams around you and having everyone around in support. You also have to remember that in my situation, I had no one. I had no family, no friends. My ex had driven them all away under corrosive control. I had no family. So there was no one to help me. And it's one of those things sometimes for me, when I see, like your father with a loving family around them, what I'm getting at it doesn't always make that difference. I had no one and I managed. Your father had a family around him, but we still have those same thoughts, whatever they may be. It doesn't always make that difference having friends and family around, because sometimes it's not always that makes the difference.
Yeah, for sure. I want to touch on that later as well, because I think that mindset of when someone takes their own life, we see it in a very black and white way, right? Whereas, you know, I did some work with Dr. Rory O'Connor, who heads up suicide research at Glasgow University, and there's a lot there that, you know, I'd love to discuss with both of you as well. How about yourself, Emily?
So I'm a two-time survivor of attempting to take my own life. Both of mine related to my gender identity, which I've talked about quite a lot, and generally coming to a crisis point. We've used some words here. Shame is one of them, and you know, that level of shame breaking through to the surface, or ridicule, or I think this is something that's really important to talk about. Is how does it feel to get to that level of being suicidal? It's, we talked earlier about media portrayals, and you'll see crime dramas where people make assertions like, "Oh, they were pushed, they didn't jump because they were still wearing their spectacles," or some amazing thing which is an indicator of that person's state of mind. And actually, it's just all nonsense. It's a complete tosh. So my last suicide attempt, and I hope it is my last suicide attempt, and I believe it will be, was in 2019. So I've just gone past my 2-year anniversary. And the only way I can describe how I felt was that the world had just closed in around me. It was like black cotton wool enveloping me. I don't think I wanted to die, but I didn't see any reason to live. I couldn't see a way of living. I couldn't see a way of moving forward. And that sensory deprivation. So, in my case, I drove to the place I was going to do it. I had to get myself into the position for doing what I was going to do. I had the presence of mind to check my phone to make sure that my life insurance would pay the mortgage for my family. So it wasn't that I was in some sort of disassociative state. But that said, the world had closed in around me. So, in terms of sensory appreciation, I didn't have any at all. And I wasn't capable of thinking about a future. I couldn't see a future. And that's something I don't think we talk about often enough. And I'm not here to say that my experience is everyone's experience, but it's certainly something I've not heard a lot of talk about how it feels. So that's good for me to know that, because if I'm ever in that situation again, I know the signs, and those signs do start. So I suffered with suicidal ideation for at least 2 decades. So I will talk to people. I can think of all of the commutes I had to work, in all of the various jobs I had over 2 decades, and I know all the places that I could flip my seatbelt off and drive my car into something that I had calculated would be fatal for me. I had all of these in my mind. Does it mean that I wanted to go and do that on that day? No. But that's not a healthy thing to be thinking about. It's a big burden to carry. It's a lot to carry. So I had that in my mind, and then for me, it was that trigger incident. So my incident in 2019 was effectively me coming out of the closet. It was that point where I was looking at potential family rejection, potential rejection from friends, potential rejection at work. How would I live? Would I be able to live as the person I am openly? I couldn't process it. I just couldn't see that future. So, yeah, that blackness is something I think we need to talk more about. We need to talk about what got me out of that. I happened to get a phone call from a friend just after I was looking on my phone about my life insurance. And a friend who's had experience of friends of theirs taking their own life, read the signs, got me back to my car, brought me back to reality, grounded me, actually ripped that black cotton wool away and reminded me of things that I had to live for. And thank God for them. I genuinely believe, had they not been able to do that, then I probably wouldn't be here. And that's something I think for all of the people I've spoken to, and I've been very open talking about my suicide attempt since. You will often hear people say, well, look, if you ever feel bad again, just give me a call. You're not going to call anyone when you're feeling like that, okay? When you are in that situation where you are deprived of that sensory experience, and again, I speak only from my own perspective, you're not picking the phone up to anyone. You're not picking the phone up to a friend. You're not picking the phone up to Samaritans. Those things are there for much earlier in that process. They're there for me now when in my peripheral vision, I can feel myself being enveloped, and I make sure I ground myself. I make sure I talk to my daughter. I talk to, friends. I talk to people then. Once you're at that stage where you're wrapped, you're not making any calls. And that's something I think, again, I would want people to understand. But I know they're coming from a good place. I know they're saying, I'm always there, give me a call. If you say that to somebody, there's two things. The first one is you're not likely to get that call at that point, at that crisis time. But if you do, what will you do when that happens? And that's the one thing I will say to people is if you are going to be that person, and thank God you want to be that person, learn about what you need to talk about, learn about the techniques that are helpful to ground people and to bring people back into a place where they can think, where they can see a future. Because it won't be good enough just to sort of groggily be just nodding along and, oh, this is terrible, or I don't know what to say, or everything will be okay. You really do need to spend some time thinking about what that means. So,
Okay.
I'm here, two times. Thank God I'm still here, and I don't want anyone to be in that situation. But the other reality, and I just wanted to talk about this, is as a member of the LGBTQ+ community, I was looking at some research that was done at the start of this year, and it's found that 68% of young LGBT+ people experience suicidal thoughts, compared with 29% of young people who are not LGBT. With lesbian young people at 74% and transgender people at 77%. So for the community I come from, it's a lot higher, and that's not because we are less mentally strong or resilient or any of those things. It's about the way society behaves. The LGBT community has to deal with a lot of societal stigma. This is one of the things we talked about in our first of these in conversation with. But the same could be said for people in the disabled community, people in the Black and ethnic minority community. Wherever there is stigma, wherever people feel there isn't a reason to carry on, that's a real risk factor for suicide.
Really, really powerful, both stories. And I think I get so much out of hearing experiences of people that have been in that situation personally, just because of the pain that I carried after my dad, of why did he do it, and trying to understand that. And if I'm honest with you, the anger that I felt towards him, the frustration I felt towards him, the unlovingness that I felt towards my dad, like, did he love me? Like, surely he didn't if he's made this decision, right? Because that was my black and white thinking then. And it took me the depths of depression and anxiety, and then going on the journey of trying to understand it a bit more. And no textbook can tell me the experience that both of you have just told me. And it's when I worked with Rory O'Connor, he spoke a lot about, firstly, that tunnel vision, as you've just highlighted, Emily. It's like someone in that suicidal position, their perception of life has collapsed, right? It's not that they can find hope very easily, or they can understand, oh, I've got this in my life, I've got this to happen in the future. It's that complete collapsed, almost tunnel vision of, I'm in control of one thing right now. Do I end it or do I not, right? And for a lot of people, that collapsed tunnel vision is so hard to get out of, as you've said, Emily. And one of the other things that he highlighted that really helped me was the burden that people feel. Because there's this black and white way of looking at it that, okay, Paul's dad was selfish. He left a wife, he left 2 kids, he left friends, he left everything, right? But what Rory really helped me understand is, in that situation, they feel like their family, the people they love, is better off without them, right? And that burden that they're carrying in that moment in time means that they're not thinking that you guys are better off without me, so I'm going to end it. And just the last thing as well, which come up from what you've both said, is that shame. Like, my dad, like this is what I've tried to get my head around over the last year or two. He run every day, if not twice a day. My dad was meditating in 2005 before meditation was cool, right? I used to walk past his room and he'd be listening to wow music. And I think, what's he doing in there? He would do yoga, he'd go Reiki, he would, he was quite, he was quite open. Like, I wouldn't say that he kind of was very black and white. My dad, he was quite sensitive, and he was okay with being sensitive. Friends, family, and academic. My dad had a psychology degree. He read like self-help books, and so I could never understand like how someone with that focus on mental health and what we all talk about everyone should do can still end their own life. And I think with my dad, he carried shame, like so much shame of what he was experiencing. I don't know what he was experiencing, but the shame because of the stigma and the silence of him being a man potentially and not being able to talk about it, that shame led him into that place that, as you said, Emily, when you're in that place, it's so hard to get out of. And I've got two questions, I think, off the back of that, if you don't mind me sort of bringing them up. The first one is what you said about that friend. When you're in that place, all it takes sometimes is a person to give you 1% of like a bit of hope, and that can get you out of that place. There's an example with my dad. My dad went out for a walk, and the way that my dad took his own life was very similar. He was out walking, and one of his friends was driving, and he saw my dad, and he pulled over. Are you okay? You're right. And he sat with him in the car, and he brought my dad home. I remember him bringing my dad home and was like, I was just a little bit worried about him, but he seems okay now. My dad lasted another 3 months after that example, right? Now, as you've said, Emily, that example of that friend taking my dad out of that state, potentially bringing him home, gave my dad another 3 months of fighting. Now, of course, in our scenario, it didn't end, but that glimmer of hope, I think, is so important. So is there anything that, we can give to people that can really encourage them to support people that might be in that situation? Because as you've said, saying, call me whenever, isn't going to be the right way of doing it.
There's something that you said, Paul, and it's very hard for me knowing the situation that you found yourself in, because on my last attempt, it was exactly that. I thought it would be better for my family if I were no longer with them. That was exactly what was in my head. It would be easier if I were dead rather than carry on and have to face up to the shame, frankly, that I carried for all those years. And it was exactly that my friend picked up on. And it was my daughter. The thing she said to me was, your daughter will love you whether you're in a dress or you're in trousers, and she will never understand. She will never be able to talk to you to understand why you did it. Those were the words she used. Mm-hmm. And that whipped me back to reality. And that was not even in my mind. I love my daughter beyond anything in this world. But at that point, before that phone call, I wasn't even thinking that way. I was thinking it'd be much better for her. She'll have everything will be much better if I'm gone. And now, rationally sitting here, having processed it, having spoken, having had lots of counselling, I can't understand why I thought that, but I did. And it was that friend saying, your daughter will not understand, and they'll never be able to ask you. So that's why I found it very hard hearing what you're saying, Paul, because you're my daughter. In that scenario, my daughter could have been you in 10 years' time, having these conversations. And I'm very grateful that my daughter isn't in that situation, but clearly, I'm thinking about your situation as well.
That's got me. Like, I'm welling up, and I don't well up that often. Yeah, it's like that hit me hard, if I'm honest, because it's like the one thing that I wish I could ask my dad is that, right? And you're trying to piece it together, and I can say that I've accepted it. And of course, I'm in a much better place. I'm in a much happier place of acceptance, and I'm very grateful for the amazing dad I had for 18 years, right? But if I could ask him, I'd love to ask him, because it's.
I would just say I don't.
Whether you actually understand, because for example, even if someone does explain, are we capable to understand what that position is like? And that's the difference. You know, sometimes we don't know, and we will never know why sometimes someone will take their own life. And even if they explain it, would they be able to understand that? You know, from my point of view, you know, you both had, you know, Paul with your family, Emily with your daughter, with me, there was no one. And for me, we talk about what it felt like. We talk, you know, a lot of people talk about losing the will to live. I flip that round. From my perspective, I had nothing to live for. There was no point in living for myself. And it comes to the point where it wasn't even worth living for my job or my beloved horse. So there was nothing to live for. So why be here? That's what was driving me. Now, I can be quite open about what brought me there. But when people say, you know, if I could ask them and they would tell us, will we still be able to understand? Will we still be able to square away what someone is telling us with what our own internal belief systems and values are? And that's also a very big thing, you know, if only I could. And it comes back to what I said before. We might not be able to understand, but we can accept that someone can get to that position where they just don't want to be here any longer.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, one thing that I've come to realize is when you reflect on it, you have a much different perspective of it when it's in the moment, right? And I think, you know, if I was to potentially ask my dad in that moment, who knows, my dad might not even have the answer himself, right? And I think, you know, I look back on my journey, and when I talk about my story, it's like, you know, I went to therapy, and then this is the reason why I went to therapy, and this is why I was feeling this way. But that's all on reflection. Like in that moment of me going to therapy, I was so unconscious to all of the reasons why I was feeling that way, but it was the sort of process of going through it. So I think that's a really key point. The other thing that sort of I would say as well is, you know, I'm sure there might be people listening to this that might be in a situation right now where they might be thinking about it. And I think, you know, the question that I would ask to both of you potentially is, you know, what can they do? Because I know how individual it is, but if someone who is in that situation where they might have suicidal ideation or be in a real crisis point at the moment, what, in your experience, would you advise them to do?
Everyone's very different. So I think if you're in a situation where you are having suicidal ideation, where you are contemplating suicide as a way out, as an option, even just as the least option in a group of them, is I would certainly reach out to a professional. So look for somebody within therapy, and there are lots of links, and I would look for somebody that the person has to resonate with you, and you have to be honest, and you have to be able to, you really do have to be able to go into why it is that you're feeling that way. You know, to your point, Paul, you know, just to continue the point we were talking about, that at that moment of crisis, in my case, had my daughter appeared magically in that place and said, "Why are you doing this?" I wouldn't have had an answer. You know, rationally, I know I've been able to say, I thought it would be better if I wasn't there. If I said that and she said, "Well, why do you think that?" No answer for that. So if you're in that situation where it's driving up, you've got to get hold of some help where you can be honest and talk about what it is that's giving you those thoughts. And that's really hard. You have to dig into the inside of yourself. Now, for me, there was a very obvious point. Now, was I ready to talk about that? Not until 2 years ago. So yeah, that's a bigger problem for me. But I think that's the thing I would say there. Now, if you're in crisis, and there are levels of crisis, and I've just talked about that envelopment of the darkness. If you're still at a point where you're not fully enveloped, I would recommend calling in. You know, make sure if you've ever had these thoughts, get the numbers into your phone. People like the Samaritans. There are, for LGBT people, Switchboard LGBT, for example, which are organisations that you can phone and you can talk to them in a crisis. I would certainly say if you can get there before it comes around you. I don't know, and I'm just going to be really honest, when you get to that crisis point, I don't know what I would suggest, because I think at that point, for me personally, I wasn't in a place unless somebody proactively got in touch, that I wasn't going to do anything. So I can only give you my view on that one, but it helps to talk, and it helps to be absolutely honest. This whole thing about suicide having a stigma, it's not a crime. Okay, it's an awful way to leave the world, and the world is better with you in it. And I'll say that to the people listening now. The world, without exception, the world is better for the people who are in it staying in it. You just can't see that when you're at that stage, and you need to be reminded of that.
I can really relate to that, and I think it's that proactivity, and I think for someone like my dad, potentially someone like me, spoke to many people like it before, that say they thought they was unbreakable until the day that they broke, right? And I think it's having that ability to say to yourself, right now, I need to go and work on this because I don't want to get into that place. And I think for me, it's a fear that I carry, and it's a fear that I'll always carry, but equally, I see that fear as a bit of a blessing that, I fear I'm going to end up like my dad, right? So that keeps me on my toes to make sure that I'm proactively managing my mental health so I never get into that situation myself. How about you, Sylvia?
Picking up on the point you just made there, and to Emily's point, when one is right at that point, I would like for people to preempt that and be aware of their mental health, be more aware of their mental health than perhaps other people are, and look after your mental health as you do your physical health, so you can spot those signs sooner, so that person doesn't get to that position that Emily spoke about there, where it is so tunnel vision, and sometimes that person can almost be unreachable, and equally that person does not want to be reached. So if we can spot their signs earlier, and then we can go and have those conversations. And it's not about talking to everyone about everything, finding that person who you can talk to, because that's one of the things that I learned, a very hard but simple lesson. I didn't think anyone was strong enough to handle what I had to say. I didn't think anyone was able to manage what I had to tell them, all the stuff that happened in my childhood. I didn't think that. But once I used to do a lot of mind reading. What if they say this? What if they say that? I learned a very hard lesson there too. And that kept me stuck in this not speaking to someone. There are people out there who can help. There really are. Me, I'm an integrative counsellor. I'm a mental health professional. But talk to someone. Talk to someone as soon as you start to feel that this is going this route. Because we have two fantastic examples, Emily and myself, which taps into the Mental Health Foundation, says that 70% of people will recover. We are too. Living proof that it's possible. Just talk to someone. And also, there's so much online stuff these days that potentially can help. But I do think talking, so it doesn't sit inside us, festering, boiling over. Sometimes just talking it through to get it out of our system. But listening, I think a point Emily made earlier about, I forget what she said, but what popped up for me was the art of really listening. Not just, oh yeah, everyone feels like that from time to time. Oh yeah, I felt like that. No, really listen to the person and understand that whilst you might not understand it, accept that they are really having a tough time and they need some help. And if you can't help them, signpost them to someone who can.
Yeah, it's we spoke about the big S and the word suicide and how difficult it is to even talk about it. And I think, from the work that I've been doing in organizations, I go in and do a talk. It's just staggering how when one person becomes vulnerable, you all of a sudden have story after story after story after story of people that they've lost or experiences that they've had. And, obviously I know we're all in this space, but even today, we could have we started with the conversation about the weather, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, Emily's making me cry, and it's really just, as you say, Sylvia, it's like we have to bring it to the forefront. We have to talk about it, because otherwise so many people feel like they can't. And I'm conscious of time, but one thing I do want to bring it into is in the workplace in particular, because I still feel like there are organizations that will touch mental health, but I'm not putting suicide on some communications to our employees. So in your experience, or what do you think employers can do in particular for World Suicide Prevention Day, or to try and start the conversation around suicide?
Events like this, simple as that. So the more people talk about it, yes, I get there are some people who say the more we talk about it, the more people may think about it themselves. I get that. But the more we talk about it, the more we can understand where people are coming from, the more we can destigmatize and de-discriminate, if there's such a word, to understand that it does exist and people do have these thoughts. And to a lot of people, it's part of their life. But moreover, what we can do about it. We can talk about it, but what can we do about it? What can we do to prevent? What can we do to look after our mental health? What can we do if it starts to deteriorate? Where is that support? How can we manage that support? Particularly in the workplace, where can those employees go to get that support? Make that support easily available, accessible, have it clearly signposted, not tucked away on some intranet. To make it so that if people start to struggle, they can do something about it, not sit and be silent and suffer in silence like I did and others do. Do something. And I think that is really the message of the organisations, is to talk about it. It is part of life. It's what happens, and let's do something about it.
I think it's an opportunity for employers to look at suicide as the very end of a spectrum of mental ill health. You know, it's not something which just happens. You know, one day you're absolutely fine, and the next day it's there. People will conceal it. People will not share their deteriorating mental health. And many organisations will have employee assistance programs, healthcare schemes, and the like. And they will often, as Sylvia says, buried in there will be a number. There will be counselling available, mental health support available. It's a great opportunity to put that front and centre and talk about it on that continuum, because that's the time. As I said in my previous answer, if you are having ideation, if you are thinking that is there's an old saying, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. If you are thinking that way, that's the time to go and get the help. And organisations, if you have employee assistance programs, it's a good time to publicise them. Bring it out of the clauses, bring it out of the intranet, get those numbers front and centre. We're not in physical buildings at the moment, but a really good thing is putting the number on the back of the toilet door, cubicle door. Put it in places where people can see it, where lots of people will go somewhere when they are vulnerable. They'll go to toilets, they can lock the door. That's an opportunity to give people that hope and that number. I would definitely say businesses should do more of that.
Sorry, Emily, I thought you'd finished there. Sorry. I would also add about having conversations. I think we all have a responsibility. If we see someone struggling, we have that gut feeling that someone's struggling, we notice some changes, is to have that conversation. To that phrase, ask twice, and ask thrice sometimes. I know from my own experience, if someone had asked me how I was, I probably would have been very defensive and given them short shrift and probably told them to go away and no on certain terms. But I also believe in my heart of hearts, I would have thought, actually, someone does care. Someone has noticed. Someone has noticed me, and someone has noticed that I'm struggling. So perhaps I would have then actually, I'll go away and do something. And it's to have those conversations. Because what's the worst that can happen? I ask Emily, are you okay? And she tells me to go away. It's not going to kill me, but it might just save Emily's life.
Yeah, I love that. I think it is, as you say, the work that we're doing, it's you have to start those conversations and not shy away from them, however difficult they might seem. And one of the things that I remind every business of, and I think you've both highlighted some really key statistics as well, is suicide is the biggest threat to a lot of employees, and if you're not talking about mental health, if you're not doing anything about it, we're discussing something here that isn't a small minority of people. We're discussing something here that the statistics show how many people it can impact. And you have to start somewhere. And I think, as you've said, conversations are really key. One of the things that I was involved in was I shared my story, which started some conversations, but then afterwards the company wanted to host a panel with some of their employees that come forward. And nothing against my talk, but that panel with employees sharing was so powerful, because it's fine for Paul to come into an organization and do a talk, but seeing colleagues that they work with every single day, and they had, as you said, Sylvia, no idea that they were in a situation or they'd been in a situation, that just started so many more conversations. And then, as you say, bringing that support sort of front and center as well during that. So there's definitely a lot more that businesses can do. I think we're all in agreement with that. Is there any more final words from anyone before we finish up? I really appreciate your honesty as well. I think this is going to be a really powerful session. Any final points?
Be kind.
And the world is better with you in it.
I love that.
Definitely better with you in it.
I can't follow that up. Those two are great. But no, thank you so much for being so honest. Like I say, conversations like this are hard, but that I'm sure we're all in agreement that if this conversation helps one person, then we'll all be happy people. So thank you so much for your time. And like I say, hopefully the session's been helpful.